I started thinking that these were mine. It wasn't about stealing, and it was never about that I was a thief. It was more like claiming. And it certainly wasn't about trying to sell it.
I think appropriation is a theory until it happens to you.
You can define it however you want, but it's basically stealing of one's image. I don't think any photographer I know feels that this is something that should be allowed.
If you go out anywhere and you talk about Richard Prince, you'll find people will get incensed about his work, or they'll rise up and defend his work in a way that I've never seen about other contemporary artists.
The campaign itself is based on a mystery, this sort of mysterious character that roams through the West.
As a photographer on the Marlboro campaign, one of the things that bothers me about Prince's appropriation is that it's without risk for him. He's taken failure out of the artistic equation.
I didn't know anything about photography, but I wanted to photograph something that had already been photographed. I mean, it was as simple as that. In order to shoot around the actual text, I could only use images that a 35mm camera could crop. So when I looked through my camera, it was sort of like I was the director. I took that slide and I gave it to a commercial lab. And what I got back was a real photograph.
The photographer who shot that image is Jim Brady. He was one of the very early photographers on the Marlboro account. Unfortunately, he's now in his 90s, he's ill, and he wasn't able to identify the image.
I was trying to make the photograph as much mine as possible. And I would just turn the focus to get some of the moire so that there was no reference that it came from a magazine page. I would do that deliberately.
The best photographs are suggestive. And what they can suggest is the truth. You know, when I first saw my photograph in Prince's body of work, I did a double take. The signature picture for his show was this image that I had made in New Mexico. And then I saw it all over town at every bus stop. And finally I went to the exhibit itself, and the first thing I wanted to do was photograph it. The guard said, no photography, please. And I said, but this is my picture. And he said, no, it's not. It's by Richard Prince.
My images were also appropriated along with Sam Abel's. I spent 12.5 years photographing on Marlboro, and he didn't just reproduce one of mine, he's reproduced a number of them.
The curator that I talked to there was able to explain appropriation, but when I asked her how she would feel if it was her image, she grew quiet and said, well, that would be different.
If a photographer takes a picture and another person copies it, is that art, or is it living off other people's creativity?
The idea of rephotographing the advertisement, that didn't happen immediately. Around the 70s, I was hired at Time Life as the stock boy. And then my job was to collate the editorial part of the magazine. What I was left with were the advertisements. No one wanted those. But around 1980, I started noticing the Cowboy was always there. And I would stare at them. I think at that time, people had a certain kind of personal crisis in believing things.
Prosperity and well-being.
To the point where, is there a future? And so what I started to believe in were the advertisements, even though I know I wasn't supposed to.
The premise was, if you smoke these cigarettes, you can be the cowboy. But Richard, he takes the cowboy out of this environment and reveals the underside of our culture.
His cowboy photograph is large, it's luscious, it's an amazing work of art. He's deconstructing the mythology of the American masculine fantasy, but one might suspect that they were taken less ironically than he intended and purchased as fabulous, spectacular images of heroic cowboys in the Old West.
In terms of the money, I don't think anybody would have made or rephotographed a cowboy in 1980 if they were thinking about making money. I just don't think it would occur to them.
In the 1990s, it was actually pretty difficult to sell his work.
Lot 7 is the Richard Prince Untitled Cowboy.
Around 2000, there was a sort of recognition of his importance as an American artist.
And I have tied bids of $1 million.
When the bidding actually began, there were a lot of people who were interested. And so there was this round of bidding going through the room, and the price went up.
$1,100,000. 709, thank you. Last chance here. For you,
Basically,
sir.
what was changing was that photography was not viewed solely as documentation or craft. And for the first time, a work of contemporary photography sold for over $1 million.
On the one hand, you have a contemporary artist who's playing on the issue of authorship, and on the other hand, you have photographers who willingly give up their authorship to create an image for corporation.
I was hired and well paid to go out and do this work. And in work for hire, which is what that contract is about, that's what you expect. That's it. I can't take a Marlboro photo that I took one of these and sell it to Coca-Cola.
I have no copyright claim on it. The photograph belongs to Philip Morris. But Richard Prince will go down in history, known for a photograph that I am the author of.
I mean, and I don't know anything about the law. I really don't. But back then, I thought advertisement was public domain. I really did. I didn't think I had anything to worry about. I was interested in using the medium as a means to an end. As far as a lawsuit, and I didn't really think about that stuff. Who owned what?
One of the interesting aspects of Richard Prince's work is that it pushes the boundaries of what is acceptable within actual copyright law. In a lot of ways, he's established precedents for how we can push this broader definition of appropriation as a creative act rather than a copyright violation.
No artist works out of a void, in that all artists refer back in some way to the artist that came before them.
I discovered this years later, that the whole Marlboro campaign came from an essay published on Life magazine in 1949 on cowboys. And if you look at the image, a real cowboy in a bandana with a rolled cigarette in his mouth and the hat, you can see where an ad man in 1953-54 got the idea to pitch this idea of the cowboy to sell their product. Making art is nothing more than continuation.
Warhol took the soup can and at the time was just ferociously attacked. How can this be art? This is a Campbell's soup can. But in fact, he elevated it into this realm of contemporary art where people had to look back and critically look at it and say, yes, this is part of our identity as Americans. Richard derives from that tradition of contemporary art. And this particular image, I think, says it best.
When we first started working on Marlboro back in the late 70s, Our crew consisted of 4 people. It was a challenge, and there was an element of danger in everything we did. I look back and I think about all the work that it took to capture those images of the West. It just grinds on me.
Unlike most photography, I'm pretty much guaranteed when I click the shutter of what I'm going to get. I can walk away and come back 3 hours later, look through the lens again. That horse is never going to move. It's always going to be in that position. And I can look at it all day. But what's interesting to me is that there's no decisive moment, you know? I thought that was kind of new.
I think in order to understand this image, you have to understand what he selected.
He's one of the last of a wild and very singular breed.
What he selected was an image of a cowboy, one of the most deep-seated myths of how we as Americans like to see ourselves. He takes it into the realm of contemporary art, which makes us look back critically at it.
Another aspect of the early 1980s when this work was shown is that it was a rough economic time. There was the onset of AIDS. It was a very bleak moment. And so these fantasies of spectacular advertising imagery, I think, appealed to a lot of people.
The image was a constructed image and gets back to that idea of what do you believe in.
Prince is an incredibly astute sorter of images. He points out the ones that are vivid and transformative and makes us look again at those images and question what they're saying to us and how we use and consume those images. Looking back, people will recognize Richard Prince as a really pivotal inventor of a new paradigm and new way of looking at culture as a subject for artistic representation. And the shift from the artist as somebody who makes something to somebody who recognizes and points it out.
This artist is going to be looked back on many, many years in the future as having held that mirror up to us as a society and accurately reflected what it means to be a late 20th century, early 21st century American.
It's an incredibly democratic process now, and that's what's so great about it. But it seems like there's a certain type of photographer who's never going to let go.
It's one of those strange situations where you know it's not your image to really complain about, but it's part of your soul. You're the one lying in there with the rattlesnakes and the ants, and you put this thing on film and someone copied it. When you're violating someone's privacy, or you're violating someone's copyright, or what they feel is their own material, that's just hard for me at my age to swallow. If it's a thing that's now part of our culture, I guess I'm just going to have to get used to it.
I do admit to making mistakes in terms of taking other people's work. And I know I have no responsibility. And I know people get mad at that. It just wasn't important who took the photograph. I took the photograph. I literally took it.
It's almost like this beauty of what he's telling us about ourselves, but also the underside of our culture, that the truth is not always about beauty. And I think Richard Prince is his great talent is to reveal this truth about who we are.
Come to where the flavor is. Come to Marlboro country.